Can you take your seats, please?
Okay, it has to be short, but absolutely.
Okay.
I'll recognize you.
Okay. Very important.
Okay.
Please take your seats. My name is John O'Brien. I'm head of communications with MCC Brussels. I'd like to welcome you deplorables to panel 2. Deplorables, of course, being a basket of deplorables, was a phrase from the 2016 US presidential election campaign. That phrase was delivered by the Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton. She used the phrase to describe half of the supporters of her opponent, Republican nominee Donald Trump. The next day, she expressed regret for saying half. So I hope that as deplorables, that we can have a good discussion, because deplorables is the way maybe that the Euro elites and the Euro media elite would describe those who have an alternative vision for Europe. The upcoming European parliamentary elections have focused the minds of European elites. According to many polls, populist parties are set to deliver strong results. In response, there has been much hand-wringing about the renewed threat of populism. And European leaders have sought to make concessions on majority views on issues ranging from migration, agriculture, and EU reform to stave off what they see could be a populist landslide. But it seems as if many are minded to reject those attempts to buy off voters, to get voters back in the fold, to get voters back in line. Farmers' protests continue across the continent, and polls show increasing exasperation with the failures of the European political business as usual set to get to grips with issues like migration. Will populism play a key role in the upcoming elections and beyond? What issues promise to unite populists from very different corners of the continent? Is there anything to learn from the different populist forces in a variety of countries? Ultimately, is populist sentiment just a response to a variety of local issues, or does the populist moment reflect anything about the state of politics within European nations more generally? We're going to hear from our panelists for about 10 minutes each, and then we're going to come out to you, the audience. And I think that at MCC Brussels, we have a very strong commitment to audience participation. So I'm going to say to you now, prepare your questions, prepare your statements, your views. We will keep everything running smoothly and short, but I do want you to fully participate as an audience. This is not just about the panel. Our first panelist is Ralph Schoellhamer. He's assistant professor in political science and economics at Webster, Vienna University. He's also a visiting fellow with MCC. His research focuses mainly on cultural factors of identity formation. He is a frequent contributor to public debate on issues such as Europe's energy crisis. And I would say that one of the best reports that MCC Brussels has produced was on nuclear and was with Ralph, and you can find that on our website. I really would encourage you to have a read of that. Our next contributor will be Francisco José Contreras. He is a Spanish jurist, professor, and politician who has been a member of the Congress of Deputies for the Vox Party since 2019. He holds a degree in law from the University of Seville, where he has also taught law and political theory since 2007. His academic work has focused on the writing of Immanuel Kant. Ulrike Guerot is a Berlin-based German political thinker and founder and director of the European Democracy Lab. The University of Continuing Education appointed her as Professor for European Policy and the Study of Democracy, a group to which she led. And finally, Sergio Velasco is a Spanish political scientist, analyst, and political commentator. He is the founder of Filosofia Política, a social media-based enterprise where he details and offers his take on Spanish, Hungarian, and Polish political developments. Without any ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ralph.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to speak to all of you. I completely rearranged what I planned to say, so in case I start rambling incoherently, just call security and have them drag me off the stage. So I'm just going to look at the befuddled looks. I don't have an Edmund Burke or any kind of great thinker as a quote prepared, so I'm going to talk about the one person that I think is, for me, always the best testing board for my political theories, and that's my mother. My mother is in her early 80s. She doesn't know what Facebook is. She has never heard about the term woke. She doesn't know what X is. So she lives in a completely different world. And I find it always interesting when I present to her the positions of the so-called far, far right and the populists, her answer uses to be, well, but that's just common sense, isn't it? And I think that's actually the key here, right? Many of the positions that we call populist 30, 40, 50 years ago, we would just have described as common sense positions. And I think this is crucial. Because even when we take the referendum in Ireland, I think the perception was that they just went too far and common sense fought back. I don't think that many people who voted in the way that we anticipated it in this referendum were thinking in the terms along, this is going to be a backlash against wokeness. I think we also have to be careful when we look at the farmers' protests that I support. But if you talk to the farmers, they have very clear ideas, they have very clear grievances that they want to be addressed. They don't consider, or not all of them, consider themselves to be the backlash against the woke movement, right? They have very clear needs. They work with the real world. They actually don't have that much time to engage with the ideological fancies that both more on the left, but also I think increasingly on the right, starts to take us over. And I think, bless you, and I think very often, it is these butter and bread issues that we should focus on. I give you one example. What has caused the rise of the AfD in Germany? Right? There were many factors, but a key factor was the debate about, very boring topic, heat pumps. Right? It was the point when the government came along and said, you need to, we're going to control how you heat the apartment. This is when people said, that's just one step too far, right? We don't understand this. Another thing, the application of law. It happened in the last couple of weeks in Germany and in Austria similarly. If a 12-year-old girl gets gang raped by a group of migrants, nobody gets arrested. If a 16-year-old girl shares some pro-AfD TikTok videos in class, 3 police officers show up at her school, she's dragged out of class and is given a talking to by police about the limits of free speech. Now, I don't know what a liberal democracy is, but I'm pretty sure a key essence is not that the police tells you, the citizens, what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say. Another element, I gotta be very honest, there is this rumor, I think it's historically not entirely correct, that supposedly Mussolini came to power because he made the trains run on time. If that really is the case, Germany is in deep trouble. Have you ever tried taking a train in Germany recently? Like, if you find one that is on time, good luck. But these are things I think are very, very crucial because for many people, and that's a good thing, right? They don't engage in the highbrow of politics. Right? For them, it's the issues of daily life. I think that most Europeans are not against immigration. I don't think that most Europeans have a problem with migration. But they know very well what we mean when we talk about the issue of migration. When they say, for example, in Germany, in Austria, in France, they want to limit migration, they are not talking about the guy from Munich moving to Vienna. They're not talking about the guy from Portugal moving to Spain. They have a very clear mental picture what they mean when they hear the word migrant. Right? They think about illegal immigration. They think about the crossings at the Mediterranean. They think about Lampedusa. So they have a very, very, very clear picture. And I think it's our obligation, what we try to do with the MCC, but also in our debate here, to help people that have a very clear and correct sense that something that's going on is wrong, to help them put that into words, because they simply have neither the time nor the dedication to think about these in these terms. Now, On another issue, real quick, the European Union has been successful. I think this is very often underestimated, but let me tell you what I mean with successful. The European Union is a 1970s solution to a 1940s problem. It was designed as a straitjacket on the will of the people. The idea was to create a technocratic bureaucracy that puts a damper on whatever quote-unquote populists might want. And I think they have been fairly successful in this. But the problem is, and this is I think where the conservative movements failed, the conservative movements never made the distinction between being in office and being in power. But there is a distinction. Being in office happens if you win elections. Being in power happens when you control the cultural institutions. And the left understood this in a way that the right did not. Like the left fights a war. The left know that you have to fight on all fronts. The right always believed, oh, these are individual battles, a little bit here, a little bit there. I'll give you another example. While the Irish, we celebrate the result of their referendum, in the same year, the Germans made a law that you can now twice, only twice, I guess some people are disappointed, you can change your gender twice a year. So I can be, I guess, when it's bikini season, I can be a woman between May and August, and I can be a man during the winter days when I have to grow out my beard. So many options now. But I would argue that every time when we win one battle, we lose other ones. And the reason why this is important, because it then creates a sense within the population, whoever you vote for, nothing ever changes. I mean, I'm not going to sing, unless nobody knows the song, but have you ever heard the song Hotel California by the Eagles? Right? There's this famous line where it says, you can check out any time, but you can never leave. And this is, for example, I would say what happened with Brexit. Right? You can check out of the EU, but you can never leave. I mean, if you look, I'm always interested in the whole Green New Deal thing, because as John has mentioned, energy has been one of my main issues. Any kind of insane rule that comes out of Brussels is adopted and made more radical by London. So I'm always wondering, what exactly was the point of leaving the EU if you then become even more like the EU? And I think that is the frustration, which brings me to my final and probably most important point. We heard today that kind of 1848 was the spring of nations and the spring of the people. But I think we're in a very interesting phase now, which is, for now, populism is a protest movement. For now, it is a sense that people are dissatisfied, so they vote for parties because they want to show their dissatisfaction, right? They not even care so much about the programs, they want to show their dissatisfaction. The right sometimes, or the populists, are a little bit like the dog that caught the car, right? Once they are there, once they kind of have bitten into the car, they don't really know what to do. But I think that's just an intermediate phase. Because what comes after the protest phase, I would argue, is the quote-unquote potentially revolutionary phase. Because what we see happening, and that is the true danger, why I always worry when I hear people talk about defending democracy. Because what is meant by defending democracy is exactly this. Make sure that democracies don't matter, right? The democratic elections don't matter. And the problem with this is, if people have the sense that their vote cannot affect any change, originally, their criticism is against the government. But it will gradually morph into a criticism of the system itself, which is why I say, and I would argue that might be also a good campaign slogan, that in fact the populists are not the biggest threat, they're probably the last hope for democracy. Not because they necessarily have the better ideas, but they reinforce a sense that within the political system, change is possible. And let's be absolutely clear, what is the point of democracy if not affecting change? I think we way too often make the argument that the point of democracy is because it's morally superior. And that might be the case, but I think that's a separate issue. The true strength of democracy is that actually the people have the possibility to voice their dissatisfaction and demand a course correction. But what is the reaction of you call them elites, I would call them unelected bureaucrats, what is their reaction? They try to make laws that make that kind of change impossible. Net zero, right? There's a significant shift against it. What do governments do? They say, let's enshrine it in law because then nothing can happen. The New York Times recently, I think 2 days ago, had a fantastic article. You all remember that Donald Trump was always railing against the deep state, and this is a great conspiracy of the deep state. Well, it turns out there is a deep state, as the New York Times admits, but it's fantastic, and we should all rally in it. Because what it does is it protects democracy from the will of the voters. And I think this is the truly dangerous direction in which we're going. Because if people sense that democracy doesn't affect the change they want, they will turn to movements that can promise that kind of change. And I believe, as I said previously, that the current populists are, and I mean this in a positive way, but they are, quote-unquote, the clownish populists. They are the Trumps, they are the Farages, they're entertaining, they're funny, they're good, they're charismatic. But I think they are not yet dangerous populists because they don't have turned against democracy itself. By the way, the same is true for the AfD in Germany. The AfD does not have an anti-democratic program. But at some point, this is going to happen. So I think this is what we see, exactly what you see in dying regimes, right? If you can no longer have the support of the people, you try to entrench yourself more and more and more, right? You try to cut the people out of the debate more and more and more because you hope it's going to blow over. But it's not going to blow over. It's only going to get worse. But to come to my final point, which I think is the most crucial one, the struggle is and remains with the permanent bureaucracy. I think we will be very disappointed if we think just if there's a change in government, then it will affect the change in policies. Because as I said before, the entire European structure was designed in a way to make sure that changes in governments don't really cause a change in politics. So what would be necessary, and that's going to be the true challenge, is to find ways to reestablish, to rebuild the bureaucracy. And this brings us back to something that has been said today, right? This is a struggle that does not just take place at the voting booth, it takes place at the universities, it takes place in media, it takes place in the world of think tanks, it takes place in the world of culture. Because what should not be forgotten, there are so many people that have been marinated in a specific worldview, which is why they act. I give you one last example as a concluding remark. The Green Party, like usually in Germany, they're a little bit stronger. In Austria, they're around 10%. In Germany, sometimes 20%. In other areas, a little bit less. And one would say, well, why do they have such outsized influence, right? Why have they been so good in agenda setting for politics? And the answer is very simple. Look at every poll in public service and in the media. Every journalist ultimately dreams to be a member or a speaker for the Green Party. And this is, of course, how they shape the public debate. This is how the agenda is being set. And this is bringing me back to what I said before. We must understand that there's a difference between being in office and being in power. If I would become the Chancellor of Austria tomorrow, I'm not recommending myself, but like hypothetically, I might have great plans and visions what to change. But beneath me is an entire bureaucracy that is left of center. I could not even get a letter put into the mail because they will try to obstruct me at any term. And this is, I think, is the problem that we have, and this is something that we have to address. We have to encourage people that think like us, that see the world like us, to go into public service, to stay in academia, to go into the culture, like all these different things, and that's a very tricky issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph. Great opening, and now we're going to hear from Francisco.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to Professor Furedi and the Matthias Corvinus Collegium for having me participate in this very important conference. Well, there has been a long-standing academic effort invested into the investigation of populism, but these efforts did not succeed in finding a clear definition of what populism means. So actually, I think the term populism is not to be taken seriously, academically. For example, as early as 1967, a two-day conference was held at the London School of Economics with the presence of such important figures as Isaiah Berlin, and the conclusions of that conference were very fuzzy. I quote from the document, these movements, these populist movements, are characterized by a belief in a return to or adaptation of more simple and traditional forms and values emanating from the people, particularly the more archaic sections of the people who are taken to be the repository of virtue. So the term populism does not have a clear theoretical content. I think the term is used polemically. It is used as one of the derogatory labels employed against those who criticized the tenet of the new orthodoxy, the new secular religion, which is, of course, wokeism. Anyone who defies wokeism in public will be vilified as populist, far-right, and all the rest. No? To give but a few examples, anyone who believes there is a new human being from the moment of conception and who therefore thinks human life should be legally protected from conception to natural death, will be scorned as populist and religious extremist. Anyone who thinks that the natural family based on the marriage of one man and one woman is the bedrock of society, and that every child has the right to be raised by his father and his mother, will be vilified as populist and maybe homophobe. Anyone who argues that women are not oppressed and are not discriminated against in the West, maybe they are in Afghanistan or in Somalia, but not in the West, will be vilified as populist and sexist. Anyone who thinks mass immigration has damaged the security of so many European cities, and particularly the security of women, as indicated by this very important book by Ayan Hirsi Ali, Prey. Anyone who says that will be scorned as xenophobe and populist, of course. And anyone who thinks Western history was not a long nightmare of imperialism, racism, sexism, and so on, anyone who dares recall that it was the West that invented democracy, that invented human rights, the rule of law, etc., will be called a populist and a racist. So we can summarize all this saying that populism is one of the scornful labels used against the new right, what I call the new right. Now, this new right should not be confused with the Nouvelle Droite inspired by Alain de Benoit in the 70s and 80s. Maybe I should call my new right the new right, no? To distinguish it from the old new right. I understand by new right the variety of new conservative parties that have emerged in Europe as a response to the failure of the established right to uphold classical values such as the innocence of children, free speech, or national sovereignty. As was said before, I have been a member of parliament in Spain for 4 years, representing the Spanish New Right party box. And I have come to the conclusion that the New Right should combine three kinds of inspirations, three ideological elements. First, conservative elements, such as the defense of the life of the unborn, the defense of the natural family, and the encouragement of birth, the encouragement of childbearing in Europe, because Europe is facing a terrible demographic crisis. Not enough children are begotten in Europe, and we are reproducing way below replenishment rate, replacement level. Conservative elements, liberal elements, that is the rule of law, an independent judiciary, and classical human rights, rights such as free speech, religious freedom, the right to property, and so on. And equal treatment by the law, very important and very degraded at present. And then patriotic elements, ideas such as the right of every nation to preserve its identity and to possess effective borders. Now, I think the new right should emphasize particularly its liberal democratic credentials, because democracy is at risk in Europe. Democracy is in jeopardy, and it is threatened not by the right, but by the left. It is the left that, for example, is undermining equality before the law with its identity politics, which bestows legal privilege on women, on non-white races, on sexual minorities. In my country, there is a new crime called gender violence, which, by its very legal definition, can only be perpetrated by males. We have special tribunals just for men, the juzgados de violencia de género. And in Europe at large, meritocracy is being displaced by diversocracy. That is, the main concern of universities, administrations, governments, and so on, is no longer the search for excellence, but the search for diversity. And it is the left, not the right, that is destroying free speech with its cancel culture. My Twitter account was suspended for some days, some years ago, because I tweeted the sentence, a man cannot be pregnant. A man cannot be pregnant. I did not say anything more. I did not call names or insult anyone. but my very statement was just offensive. The Spanish press at the time was greeting the great news that for the first time in history, a man had given birth in Spain. In college, in the media, even in the church, it becomes ever more dangerous to challenge the dogmas of the new woke religion. I think the success of the new right depends upon its ability to manage an adequate, a reasonable equilibrium between these three components: conservative, liberal, and patriotic. And vice versa, the big danger for the new right would lie in getting rid of some of those components. And as I have just said, the preservation of the liberal ingredient is particularly important. So the new right should beware of fringe minority groups, extremist groups that reject democracy, that reject human rights. These groups are tiny, they are not representative, but they should be excluded from the new right. And another deviation for the new right would consist in the one-sided strengthening of its nationalist, patriotic ingredient at the expense of the liberal and conservative ingredients. This is what I call the fetishism of sovereignty, which is the irrational belief that once national sovereignty is restored, all problems will be solved magically. But sovereignty is a form of collective freedom, and as every other form of freedom, it is not an end by its own sake. It is an instrument for achieving certain goals. So the new right should explain what it intends to do with national sovereignty once it is reestablished. I think the new right should employ sovereignty for the pursuit of liberal and conservative goals. I think Brexit illustrates perfectly the point I'm trying to make. Certainly, the United Kingdom is more sovereign now than it was 8 years ago. But has it become less woke? Has it managed to solve its problems of mass immigration, for example? Did birth rates and marriage rates increase in Great Britain? I don't think that's the case, which proves that national sovereignty is no magical wand. Finally, there is a sense in which the use of the populist label with regard to the new right could find some justification. And I think it is the tendency of parts of the new right to distinguish between the elites and the people, portraying both groups as homogeneous and claiming to represent the latter, claiming to represent the people. I think the abuse of this anti-elite rhetoric could be dangerous for the new right, because it is a kind of replica of the tendency of the left to externalize responsibility, to shift the blame elsewhere. If my life is a failure, it is not my fault. It is not because I made the wrong choices. It is the fault of capitalism. It is the fault of racism, of sexism. That's the leftist way to think. Well, if my life is a failure, it is not my fault. It is the fault of George Soros. It is the fault of Bill Gates. It is the fault of the World Economic Forum. This would be the right-wing version of the same externalizing, responsibility externalizing way of thinking. And I think it's a mistake. I think the new right should not fall prey to conspirative theories. It should always uphold individual responsibility. It should not indulge in a simplistic demonization of the so-called globalist elites, because neither the elites nor the people are homogeneous. I quote William Galston, who wrote something interesting about this. Anti-elitism is divisive by definition. In the context of popular sovereignty, splitting a country's population into the people and the others implies that some parts of the population, because they are not really part of the people, do not deserve to share in self-government. It is not a good idea for the right to relaunch the old, toxic, Marxist idea of class struggle and class hatred under the guise of anti-elitism and anti-globalism. So this is my view of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. Ulrike?
Oops. So, first let me say that I'm very thankful to MCC and to Frank for the invitation to have a discussion about European populism in a sort of populist environment itself, and to discuss whether European populism is on the march, meaning whether it is a danger for Europe, more precisely for the EU. When I worked for Wolfgang Schäuble in the 1990s, in the times of the Maastricht Treaty, and a little later for Jacques Delors, when the Euro, the enlargement, and the European Constitution were prepared, I never thought that once I would need to discuss the danger of European populism, as we thought we would shape a united and strong Europe with and for the people and not against them. Jacques Delors, for instance, always said that Europe needs a soul, that the citizens are key, and that the EU should take care of the European workers. Tempi passati. So it feels very strange to look at the EU some 30 years later and to find a superstructure of EU technocracy lacking basic elements of democratic proceedings, which is creating a rejection and resentment among pluralities of citizens across the continent. The least to say is that the EU didn't achieve what it wanted to be and what at least Delors, Mitterrand and Kohl wanted, a full-fledged political union with a clear binding of its citizens to the policy process. I would like to remind that the discussion about the notion about European citizenship, la citoyenneté européenne, was key in the constitutional making before 2003. Now, to answer the question whether European populism is on the march, I'd like to make three remarks, not so much on the prospects of populism in the forthcoming EP elections, but more in the aim to theorize the populist movement we are experiencing. In doing so, I follow mainly Pierre Rosanvallon, French historian, who talks about the 21st century as the populist century. His analysis regarding populism as transformative power seems key when it comes to analyzing the populist impact on the EU system. This gets the discourse out of the problem that populism has become a synonym for legitimate governmental critiques of all kinds. So firstly, rather than considering populism as a pathology of democracy, we should understand that populism is revolutionary for politics in the 21st century, probably as much as liberal parliamentarism in the 18th century, following the political thought of Adam Smith or John Stuart Mill, and socialism in the 19th century, based on Proudhon or Jean Jaurès. If that is the case, then what we are lacking is a coherent theory of populism as the dominant ideology for politics in the 21st century. It would mean to understand populism as a theoretical offer to reflect on the reality of our political systems, including the EU system, rather than trying to ban populist forces. This would demand to focus less on the origins of populism, such as farmers' protest, but on its revolutionary nature. Rather than stigmatizing populism, which only fuels populist forces and drives society into polarization, populism should be seen as an engine to transform democracy for the better. A democracy which is putting itself constantly into question in order to become more vital. With respect to the current institutional deadlock of the EU, populism could be a decisive trigger to bring back the EU system to what it wanted to be, a political system with strong ties to its European citizens. Second, the historical process we are in is that we are rendering an abstract people visible and tangible, and digitalization has a huge impact here, as expressed in notions such as liquid democracy. The transition we are in seems to be that an abstract people so far kept away in forms of political representation is getting real. This is a trigger to reconsider the modus of representation, which is a key demand of populist forces when they insist on the people as the sovereign. The goal is somehow to peel off the people from the modus of representation in parliaments through political parties. French philosopher Simone Weil wrote already in the 1940s about politics without parties, because parties always follow their own interest and not, as she wrote, the road of truth and justice. Today, political parties everywhere suffer from less and less representativity, because classes of society can't be easily identified any longer, individualization has taken over, and identity politics have fragmented and atomized societies. Societies across Europe are shifting to situations of nobody's power and everybody's power. Yet the populist desire to install the people as the sovereign seems in this sense like a nostalgic reaction to the liquefaction of society, instead of understanding the structural transformative potential of populism. Third, a grand typology of populist forces in Europe would probably state that beyond all differences, a structural element is a horizontal understanding of class division, overcoming the left-right paradigm. Oligarchy against people or corrupt elites, the 1% against the 90-90, etc., triggering the preference for direct democracy in a non-mediated way through institutions. French political scientists like Bruno Amable call this the politics of the bloc bourgeois, where the underdogs, on the right, the farmers or the little shop owners, and those on the left, workers, in our days the invisible workers of Uber or Amazon, are together against the upper class. Chantal Mouffe and Ernest Laclau have done important theoretical work to show that liberal democracy resides in two antagonistic articulations which are incompatible, and so radical lefties, they paved the way for the feature of illiberal democracy as later described by Yascha Mounk. What clashes here is the democratic majoritarian vote against liberal features of society, especially within the EU. Populist radicalization, Mouffe and Laclau say, needs to go against the cult of the individuum at the price of people's sovereignty. This, I argue, is the biggest intellectual stretch populist party will need to theorize. How to be freedom parties when not abandoning the sovereign of a people in a singular setting. Or, to give you a quote from Hannah Arendt, if man wants to be free, it's precisely sovereignty that he will need to let go. To conclude, if one could work on a theory of populism and conceptualize it as a coherent and perhaps the most important ideology of our times, a revolutionary driving force for changing the modalities of the political system in the 21st century, its modus, the forms, the procedures, the ways of expression, and the modalities of democracy, then one could see already the tremendous populist impact on getting to grips with the liquidation of society and its desire to experience new forms of representation. The good news is, this is already happening. So populism, in a way, had already a huge structural impact. Participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, digital-based liquid democracy, citizens' assemblies, ballot systems, aleatory democracy or referenda are broadly discussed these days and increasingly complement current parliamentary systems in Belgium, Switzerland, France, the UK, Canada, etc. Empirical data show that citizens' engagement under specific conditions can bring very good results in municipalities, but also on the European level. The problem of the Conference on the Future of the EU, pursued in 21 and 22, for instance, were not the method or the content of the citizens' proposals, but the fact that the EU Council, so the heads and states of government, wiped them away precisely because some of the citizens' proposals were much too radical. In essence, the understanding that democracy isn't, in any case, a static thing that Western liberal democracy somehow brought to perfection, and they must now, in its current state, be defended against the populist, but to underscore the ever-experimental character of democracy would help enormously to reframe the impact of populist forces, by example, on the European system. Populist parties could have a decisive enabling and pathmaker role for this transformation. It would demand, though, that populist forces themselves, instead of dreaming from a homogeneous people, clear-cut identities, and the people as the sovereign and singular, which are both static and myth, reveal their revolutionary potential for endemic system change in the democratic surfaces of our time. In short, they should shift from people's populism to citizens' populism, what Rosan Vallon calls homme-peuple, the man-people representation. In other words, history is asking us whether we find new technical tools to represent la volonté de tous of Rousseau. I can't elaborate here, but going down that route, the notion of the republic, rather than the notion of a people, has much to offer here, as Hannah Arendt spells out in her Political Grammar of Founding, meaning the permanent foundation of citizen council, as the republic means both equality before the law and common good. In this sense, the dialectical loop might be that a constructive and modernizing populist transformation as a revolutionary force for politics in the 21st century comes best without a people, at least without a homogeneous people, and this precisely might open a leeway for a citizens-based, renovated, and modernized European democracy producing the good for all.
Thank you, Ulrike. Sergio?
First of all, I would like to thank the NCC Brussels, Frank Furedi, and Jacopo Reynolds for the invitation and the trust placed in me. Populism is a way of doing politics. It has no ideology. It can grow from center, left, right. We have many examples of it. In the left, we have the socialist radical occupation, most known as Syriza in Greece. Most of you will know for the former finance minister in Greece in 2015, Yanis Varoufakis. In the center, we have the ecologism in Italy of the 50s. And in the right, we have some examples like Donald Trump in the United States or Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. Also, we have a recent case with libertarianism with Javier Milei in Argentina. So the big question is, it is a bad thing that we have to tackle with just a negative connotation that has given to it. The status quo has used the term populist to try to denigrate and destroy the new parties that were and are emerging and challenging the establishment. They denigrate the term as they did with far-right, racism, homophobia, and so on. And now they are using these terms lightly without any real value of the word. And who denigrates the term? The enlightened elite, so-called the globalists. And who they are? The mainstream parties, the EU bureaucrats, the mainstream media, and most of the academics of the universities. In fact, populism is inherent in democracy. Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States, is considered by many experts as the first populist president. Jackson, a self-made man of humble means, became a president with a clear and voracious program on which stood the common man. In his presidency, he fought against the political power, reforming the administration to do it less corrupt and more competent. He also advocated for the redistribution of the money in different local banks and not in one, confronting the banker elite of the Eastern United States. Andrew Jackson believed that the three principal enemies of the common man in the United States were the banker elite, the economic foreign elite, and the political power. That's why he tried to fight it and defending the farmers and the workers. That's why he also was so loved and so hated at the same time. In his work, Jackson said, the farmers are the basis of society and true friends of freedom. If you want to look further, David Brown, a professor of history in Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, argued his populist positions in his book. the first populist, the fine life of Andrew Jackson. Actually, to be a populist is to use a purely popular speech of the people and for the people, not to use technologies, to use a language that can be understood by everyone, even if it's at times vulgar. In the case that we are focusing today on this conference, the European case is a clear example of the new conservative right parties, in the ECR parties and group and ED group. And now they are using these methods, and as we have seen, they worked. It worked in Portugal with Chega, it worked in Italy with Fratelli and Lega, it worked in Sweden with pseudo-democrats, in Finland with the Finns, in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders, and also worked in some regions in Spain with Vox, and also in France with the Le Pen's party's importance. And we have seen before, in Poland with Law and Justice Party, and in Hungary with Orbán's Fidesz. After all, the new conservative parties are focusing on the real problems of the people. Nobody wakes up and say, you know what, now I feel a little bit fascist, I will vote the far right. I didn't wake up someday and I say to my mom and my mother and my father say, you know what, mom, father, I think today I'm a little bit more fascist and I will vote Vox. No, it's because they are focusing on the real problems of the people, and that's why they have this importance in the polls and in some governments. Many times, the European elites don't see the real problems of the worker, rancher, or any other close people that is not in the closed cycle, because they are away from the countryside and the people and don't see these problems. And we have a recent case about this. Many times, farmers complain about the protection of the wolf, and the European elite didn't care about it at all, until the moment the pony of Ursula von der Leyen was attacked by a wolf. In that moment, she decided to hold a debate on the issue. Illegal or mass migration is another issue that the working people are suffering the most. Why? Because the Center for Foreign Unaccompanied Minors, and in Spain we call it MENAs, are usually installed in working class neighborhoods, as well as illegal immigrants, in which in the end means that the problems that they may generate end up having the workers, something that the academics, politicians, or non-establishment cannot suffer in their own face and don't see the real consequences of their acts and laws. Also, as we have said, agriculture is another issue that are bringing some problems. European laws have looked hard against European farmers, with more taxes, more regulations, and more taxes. Likewise, they also threaten one of the pillars on which the EU was founded, the free trade between member states. They threaten it by third country agreements with the EU, causing disloyal competition, as they can use another products and they don't have the same requisites. For this very reason, as we have seen this month, European farmers are fed up. And that's why they claim a slogan that is so true. How a European bureaucrat that has never stepped on the land in his life could know the real problems of a farmer in Italy, Spain, or Hungary. It's just impossible. Reader Scruton, in an article that he published in The Conservative a few years ago, entitled Politics Needs First Person Plural, said the populist was danger, since populists only represent part of their electorate and forgot about the rest of the country, and threatened the stability of democracy and representativeness. With all respect and admiration that I have for Roger Scruton, I think, with my humble opinion, he was wrong here. Populist movements are born precisely because mainstream parties and democracy as we know today has ceased to represent the ordinary person, on which laws are passed that nobody has voted or were not even in electoral programs or in electoral promises. As such, there are laws that we have seen that was passed in European Union, or the amount of money or armament that is being given to Ukraine without citizens' promisement. The voter loses all his power in the moment that he deposits his ballot box his vote in the ballot box. That is the only real power that the citizens has. Once the vote is deposited, we can no longer do anything against the laws enacted by governments, only protest, and the largest percentage of these protests fails and doesn't result in anything. That is the real danger. The Western democracies are becoming more and more opaque, and the citizens have no power at all. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. It's that time. It's that time when you get to ask the questions, you get to make the statements. And I really would urge you to participate now, because what you don't want to happen is for you to be going home and say to yourself, I should have said something. That was my moment. I should have taken the opportunity. So now is your opportunity to get involved. I'm going to take a couple of statements, a couple of questions, and then I'm going to go back to our panel and give you the opportunity to respond to them. I'm going to start with this lady over here. Can we get a microphone to her, the lady with the glasses, please? Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Tatiana. I'm an anthropologist, and my question is mostly to Ralph. And
Speak up a little higher, please.
Okay.
Stand up.
You made the difference between being in office and being in power. What is your opinion about all the lobbies? Because this is also a place where the power is expressed. And my concern right now is about the ESG directive, which is going to kill our industrial tissue in Europe. So how come that big companies never did any substantial work in terms of lobbying against that?
Got it. Thank you very much. Wonderful. I'd like to go over here. There. You had your hand up a moment ago, so I'm going to take you. Microphone over here, please.
Okay, well, this is a question to Ulrike Guerot. So I'm a great admirer of you because you fought the COVID lockdowns so bravely. But I'm not sure if I agree with the national sovereignty thing, because I do believe that national sovereignty is very, very crucial. In fact, I don't believe there are any citizens without national sovereignty. And I'm also not so convinced about the early, was not the EU, but the early European unification, because we keep, I believe that Jacques Delors was a man of great format and probably better than politicians we have today. But if we go back right to the start, the EU, the forerunners of the EU, the Roman treaties, were from the beginning an attempt to keep the people out, the populace out of a lot of decisions. And it wasn't uncontested. So you had the early SPD, the Social Democrats in Germany, for example, who were quite opposed to it. People forget that Helmut Schmidt voted against the Roman treaties. Kurt Schumacher, incidentally, somebody who spent nearly 10 years in a Nazi concentration camp, called it the unification of bureaucrats, saying important decisions on the economy, like steel and coal, were being taken away from popular decision-making in the nation states. So, I do think this thing about national sovereignty is a hugely important issue, and I would fight it because I think it is linked to democracy.
Got it. Thank you very much. Down here at the back.
Hi, I'm Maren Tom from MCC. I do have a really genuine question that I really don't know the answer to. What do you think is going to happen if or when Nancy Fraser pushes through her Demokratieförderungsgesetz? What's going to happen?
Okay, thank you very much. Start with you, Ralph. Do you want to take that first question?
Sure. It's a fantastic question. I'm actually very happy that you brought it up, and I think the answer is a kind of dirty secret, which is that large companies love regulation. Imagine you and I start a company, and the first thing the government does is they say, oh, of course you can start a company. Here are 8,000 pages of regulation you have to follow. So we have to fire 10,000 lawyers who work us to these 8,000 pages. If I'm Daimler, if I'm BMW, I can afford the people to do this. You and I, as a startup, we can't. This is why we no longer have a significant startup culture in Europe, because the first thing you need is an accountant and a lawyer that helps you through the regulation and the tax code. And this is how I deter this. So the idea that the companies, it's the same with the free market. Companies hate the free market up until the point when they have a monopoly. Then they hate the free market. This is why, as a side note, my advice, the biggest mistake of conservatives in the past was to believe that libertarians are our allies. The libertarians are not our allies, right? Because they believe in exactly this, that the free market will always end up in then this perfect competition, this perfect situation. But it drives towards a monopoly because companies want to have a monopoly position. They're not interested in competition. And regulation allows them to do this. Take the banking sector, an even better example. It's impossible to found a new bank. Too big to fail was the greatest gift that a bank could ever get.
Okay. Ulrike.
So, yeah, to answer here, I think you're right that, I mean, I think there are a lot of history books to be written on the real origins of Europe, and some are already out. And yes, obviously the Rome Treaty had, say, neoliberal features already in terms also of the economic making. There are huge studies about, for instance, if you want a social market economy, that all this was wiped off and so on and so forth. I would still argue that Article 1 to Article 12 of the Maastricht Treaty would introduce a notion of European citizenship, which was at least the idea to go or to achieve a sort of politicization of the political system, so democratization. And I totally admit that it failed. It totally failed. But if you look at the period of, say, 92 Maastricht to, say, the European Constitution, 10 years, yeah, then it was over. I agree. But if you look at the Laken process, especially Article 22 European Treaty, which is the notion of European citizenship in an evolutionary sense, so that we go out of this market citizenship, as in academics you would say, I would still argue that perhaps that was the 10 years chance in which we could have had a way to power whatever democratized European system. Yeah? That it fails, I agree. That there was other intentions before, I also agree. But that we had a chance to shift it differently in 92, I would still argue. Perhaps I'm marked by my own socialization, as everybody is, yeah. But I worked for Jacques Delors. I know many people of the process by then. So obviously I cannot unmake my own sort of socialization in these 10 years, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to stop you there. Sergio, Francisco.
The next question is still the most important one about the national sovereignty, but let's go.
Okay. No, if you can say it very briefly, please.
Well, I mean, I mentioned Hannah Arendt, yeah? If man wants to be free, it's precisely sovereignty that he needs to let go. There's a huge literature about what sovereignty is in the end, and we can't discuss it in a minute here. But then there's also a huge discussion about what is a nation state. So if you combine the two sort of notions which are unclear, what is sovereignty and what is a nation state, yeah? Because do you base nation state on identity? Do you base nation state like the French do, Marcel Mauss and all this school, more on social rights, same social rights, yeah, you have many different outcomes of what national sovereignty actually would mean, and that is why I ended my little presentation with the notion of republic, which is more about civic or citizens' representation in a permanent form. I mean, we understand Hannah Arendt as a liberal thinker, but actually she was more closely to, say, Räterepubliken and the Bolsheviks in a way, yeah?
Okay.
Also, this needs to be rediscussed, but if you want to be the voice of the people, the other question, and that I wanted to stretch, is why not giving people the direct voice through citizen councils and so on and so forth,
okay,
which is when the idea of the republic was born in the...
Going to stop you there. Thank you. Sergio.
The answer will be very short. I think that the free market is a crucial thing, but it's true, and what Rafael mentioned, that in some liberals and libertarians fails in the terms of free market because it's just an illusion. The real free market that they are saying is only theory books, not in the real life, because there are states that helps companies. There are another states that are helping the companies to go another country and compete with another companies that they don't have this help of the state, and they don't have the same conditions. That's why I think they fail in this idea of the illusion of free and market that can solve all the problems, because it's not true.
Okay.
Well, I just want to say that we have no alternative to free markets anyway. So if we want to return to the original real free market, what we need to do is cut down on regulation, have less regulations, make them, simplify them, so that all companies, not just the big ones, can afford the lawyers and all the rest.
Yeah. Raise your hands, please. Okay, Thomas.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas Orban, European Conservative. Mr. Schoellhamer, you mentioned this dog and car situation. Now, hypothetically, if all these populist movements in Europe were to succeed and were able to build up institutions like the left did, and were able to build up stable systems in several countries, in 10 years, how do we avoid becoming the new establishment? How do we avoid, hypothetically, what are the pinnacles that we need to keep in mind to not become those who we fight against?
Great. Over here, the gentleman who has his hand raised. Yes.
Yes, good. Thank you. In trade test.
It's working fine.
Okay, perfect. The question is...
Would you stand up, please?
Get the disabled up, huh? Thank you. Good. My question is the following. I hear a lot about explanation of populism, but it's all about the needs of the quality of life. So we have different groups, different people with different needs. So my question to the panel is, why didn't hear any of the Maslow pyramid, because that is where the pressure is, and where the pressure is, it's where the populism is. Or am I totally wrong?
Okay, thank you. Yes, at the back, Jacob.
Yeah, Jacob Reynolds, MCC Brussels. I just wanted, I guess, to make a plea to the panel, maybe, I think one of the key challenges with populism is finding the right language to express it. And one form of language that really holds us back is the language of left and right. And it's much, much more helpful, I think, to think of populism in terms of establishment and anti-establishment. And this helps clarify a couple of things that have come up from the panel. The first thing it clarifies is the economic questions, which is less a question of do we like free markets or do we like socialism or whatever, more a question of how do we challenge established players that have captured industries, captured regulations, captured states, and challenge those and allow new stuff and new creativity to come out. And the other thing is this is Ulrike's, to my mind, slightly strange fascination with citizens' assemblies and consultative democracy and these kind of things, because those are precisely the tools that are beloved of the establishment. If you go to any country in Europe, the first thing any of the elites want to do is start a citizens' assembly or do a consultation, because those things are always already captured by the NGO class. So I think it's much more helpful for us if we think of politics in terms of establishment, anti-establishment. That can guide our attitude to populism.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to the panel immediately. Anyone on the panel want to take any of these questions up? Be brief, okay?
Just to say that I'm totally informed about all these theories about simulation of democracies with the Citizens' Assembly. Yeah? So I'm not a sort of naive admirator. I just wanted to say that if the goal of populism is to give people a voice, then we need to find the form how they speak. Yeah, because there was the question in the room of the other man who said, how can you or the conservatives prevent to be the same sort of elite thing in 10 years from here? So that's precisely where the problem is.
Francisco?
Yes, well, I don't agree with the idea that the old axis, left versus right, is outdated, and we should replace it with the new axis, globalism versus patriotism or nationalism. I think reality is complex, and the globalism versus nations issue has gained importance, but this doesn't mean that the right versus left axis has lost all its relevance. In my speech, I mentioned a few questions in which the rightist classical positions were significant. I mean, I spoke about the right to life of the unborn. I spoke about the natural family, about marriage, about free markets and equality before the law. I think all of these were values associated to the classical right. And I consider them to be right-wing values. No? So I think the concept of right and left still has some meaning, in my opinion.
Ralph?
Yeah, real quick, I mean, I think it's a myth to believe that there ever have been societies without an establishment or without an elite. So I have no problem if you, for example, Tamas, are part of the elite in 10 years. The problem with the current elite is that they hate their own civilization. And that is what really kind of riles up the right. I mean, I can give you example after example after example of green politicians who say that Robert Habeck, the German Minister for the Economy, said, well, he hears the word patriotism, it makes him want to vomit. Right? And this is kind of my problem with an elite that works against its own civilization. If everybody at the top would be, not traditional, but would at least show without any kind of shyness or guilt a dedication to the country, I would have no problem with this. I'll give you one example for this, which I think people still don't understand the Donald Trump phenomenon. Donald Trump was not far right. I mean, look at the man's biography. If you tell me that this is the true conservative, I mean, that's ridiculous. The guy who sleeps around with porn stars, pretty sure that that is not the definition of a conservative. the guy who's a billionaire and wears the same suit all the time, but he made one thing clear. Whether he just plays it, I don't know. But he says he loves America. He is a nationalist. He believes that the laws must primarily serve their own people. He believes that the economy must primarily serve their own people. And that resonated. That resonated with people. Nobody said, oh my God, he's a billionaire and I'm poor. The Americans don't care about this. And there was another question about the Demokratieförderungsgesetz in Germany, the democracy enhancement law, whatever you want to call it. This is exactly what I mean, right? Basically, what the German government is currently trying is to enshrine in law that the taxpayers for eternity have to pay for left-wing causes independently of who's in government. And this brings me back to what I said before, the difference of being in office and being in power. The left understands that difference, and I think the right still doesn't get it.
Thank you. Hands, please. Okay, this gentleman here. Microphone. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Rudy Roth. I'm the scientific and recently investigative reporter. I have a very quick statement to make regarding what's called in Belgium the cordon sanitaire against what they call extreme right. Yesterday, a new guy has been selected by a Flemish right party, NVA, to represent the party in Wallonia, the French party. Immediately, the press started a witch hunt against that guy I've never seen in the press. It's a scandal. His name is Godefriedi. He's not an extreme right. He's just alt-right center wing. And another scandal that happened 1 hour ago in the Belgian parliament, extreme anti-Israel left woke wing disturbed the parliament. Now my little question about populism. Two basic elements for me in democracy are human rights that we have, basic human rights, and free speech. Shouldn't we go back to the circle that Jeremy Stubb drew virtually on the screen, that we should have populism, human rights, and free speech in that one circle. And one should not go further than the other one. We have now, take an example,
okay,
basic human rights is good, but now we have extended human rights who in fact attack populism.
Okay.
One way or another. So what do you think about this part? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We're going to take the gentleman at the back.
Paul Boniface. Genuine question. The intellectual roots of the populist movement, should we situate those in modernity, in the conflict between freedom and equality, or are the roots in a much more ancient tradition that preceded modernity, in Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas? Doesn't this movement represent more those ideas than the ideas of freedom and equality?
Hey, Sergio, do you want to pick up any of those?
Yes. The first one, I think what he says, it's true. The free speech is one of the basis of democracy and society. And I will put an example, you put a few of that, for example, the Socialist Party in Spain, or Podemos, the far left in Spain, when they have a speech and there are some journalists, they ask them some questions, and maybe they are more right, this kind of journalist. They say, you're a fascist, so I will not answer your question. The Germany, if a mainstream party, or Viktor Orban, for example, says to a media and says, no, I will not answer you because you're woke or you're communist, and I will not answer. All the media, the mainstream media, will blame Orban with reason. But when the Socialist Party or the mainstream parties are doing this, nobody says nothing. So I think the free speech is one of the keys, and we have to respect them and protect them.
Real double standard there, yeah. Ulrike, yeah.
Just a sentence to the question there, but yes, I agree. Yeah? I mean, if you go back to Politeia and Platon, the populace is about everything, and it's a whole. So I would also argue that populism is a structural form that is much more than obviously guaranteeing free speech and human rights and so, but that it is in essence the theory how to organize a common living together, the inter-esse, and that's why sovereignty is a difficult terminus technicus here. But I agree. All politics is populism in a way. That is the essence. Yeah.
I'd like to ask the panel. The left are making much of the division between populist groups, or the difference between populist groups. Would that difference affect the ability of national populist groups to work together within the European Union, and how serious of a problem do you think that might be? Is it a matter of will be chaos, or is it a matter of that there would be unity in diversity? Ralph?
Well, I think we have to be careful not to kind of be guilty of the Judith Butlerization of the debate and kind of make it more complex than it is. Look at what the so-called populists are asking for. I come always back to what I said at the beginning of my presentation. Most of these positions are common sense positions. The idea to control immigration, the idea kind of to have equality before the law, like these are not revolutionary concepts. So I'm absolutely certain that within the European framework, different parties from different countries can work together. I would just add on one quick thing, which is when we talk about threats, be that either to democracy or to free speech and these kind of things, I have a very simple rule of thumb for me to decide whether or not I like a movement or not. And this is what's their attitude towards humor. And look at which political movements try to police jokes, right? Which political parties try to police humor. And there is no greater sign of insecurity and totalitarian tendencies within than political movements that say that's not funny. That's to me always the end of any kind of conversation.
Francisco?
Yes, I think there's a variety of populist right-wing parties in Europe, and these parties should learn to agree to disagree over certain subjects, but still find a common ground of issues around which they can unite. And I think that common ground is feasible and is obvious. It should include at least the defense of free speech, the defense of equality before the law, the right of every nation to decide how many immigrants it needs and how to control the migration flows. All of this, I think, could enable a consensus, a minimum consensus among these kind of parties.
Thank you. I'm going to take this woman over here. It's your last chance, so put up your hand if you want to, your last chance before the metro to actually say what you need to say. Yes.
Hello, I'm Nina Wolf, and I'm a historian. It brings about the question because we're talking quite a bit about the defining populism and liberalism and all of this, but we're not talking about one thing, which is the root cause of the issue of one of the main issues, which is migration. And controlling migration, yes, of course, each country, nation state wants to keep their individuality, but at the same time, with 100 million homeless and stateless people, how are we as individuals and as groups going to help control the root of the problem? Because most refugees, and I am the child of a refugee, would like to go home again. But if it's not safe to go home again, we're always going to have that problem.
Thank you. Over here. Microphone.
Thank you, Francisco. A very quick comment. Thank you for your sobering remark on populism that can't be anti-elite. But I think if you combine your remark with Ralph's, that it's not anti-elite, but anti-system, the more difficult danger that I see is that populism becomes an automatic Pavlov's response as a protest. Whatever they do, we do the opposite. And we can't be only a protest movement. I would see that as a more difficult danger to overcome. Would you agree?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to give the panel an opportunity in really a minute to actually just sum up anything that you want to say, starting at the end with Sergio.
Okay, for the question that about refugees, I think that obviously it's quite difficult to search what kind of refugee we will have to take, but I will take note Peter Sziarto, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Hungary, and I think that for refugee, it's going to the first safe country that they can go. That is the real question of the refugee. As, for example, if they go from Syria, there's several countries, Muslim countries, that can be safe for them, and they can have a better opportunity there, and they have the same culture, the same values, and so on. But going to Europe and forcing the people to accept them and so on, I think it's a huge debate that these states, Germany or Spain or Italy, has to have in their own, not to let they forcibly enter.
Thank you. Ulrike?
Well, in Germany, we call a discussion about so-called Fluchtursachen, so the reasons why people depart. So, I mean, there is a problem about colonialism, there's a problem of sharing, there's a problem of franc CFA, whatever. I mean, if we would be a little bit more fair in our agricultural policy, perhaps we could shrink migration, but also I would like to see the potential. I mean, if you look at demography, what is happening in Europe, and look, I mean, I don't know, when you go to Africa and they say if we got to talk to the Chinese, we get an airport, if we talk to the Europeans, we get insults. You know, perhaps there's a potential to lift here. But the other question in going over these questions, structural terms, is a question I would like to raise, because if everybody's so keen about national sovereignty and it's so difficult to basically pin this down, is there any chance to go for European-wide referenda? How would the populist movement judge this? Because if you're so sure that you have the people behind you, then that should be a leeway for bringing these things around, yeah? But it would obviously clinch with the notion of national sovereignty. So I'm just putting this in the room, because on the 25th of October in the European Parliament there was this discussion about the European Convention. There were some proposals about organizing a European-wide referenda. So if you're sportive in a way, you could say, okay, let's do a European-wide referenda on all these questions like migration and so, but it would at least, what I want to achieve, structurally change the mechanisms of the surface of democracy. You know, that was my contribution about, which is how can the populist power be a force to break up current forms of representation?
Yes, well, I would have liked to address the question the lady was putting about the root cause of migration. Well, I think the cause is mostly demographic, and I referred to that briefly in my own speech. Europeans have given up on reproducing. We do not breed sufficiently. No? The fertility rate in my country is 1.1 children per woman. That is half of the replenishment rate. We are having half of the children we would need in order just to replace the previous generation. So the cost is not mostly economic, in my opinion, or political. It is a demographic crisis. It is a demographic cause. We have created a vacuum, a generational vacuum. There are not enough young Europeans, and this vacuum is being filled by African, Asian immigrants. As for the general view of populism, I agree with the professor that there is a risk that right-wing populism becomes an exclusively negative creed, always in opposition to something. No? We oppose this, we oppose that, but we should also be able to provide positive, constructive alternatives. And I am worried also about the temptation or the possibility that populism throws the baby out with the tap water, as the Americans say, that is, become desperate about some concepts that have been very relevant historically. I am talking about the concept of human rights. Human rights, someone was mentioning this before too. It is true that the woke left has invented many fake new rights, like the right to get an abortion, the right to change your own gender, and things like this. But this is no reason for believing that the old category of human rights is despicable. The classical human rights, the human rights of 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are still fully acceptable and Yes, indispensable.
Thank you. Ralph, very briefly.
Yeah, real quick. I mean, whatever the root causes of mass migration are, I think we will never be able to solve them if, in trying so, we destroy our own countries. And I think this is the sense that many people have. And of course, these migration streams are not equally distributed, right? As you mentioned before, birth rates. Well, the Japanese have worse birth rates in many ways. The South Koreans have worse birth rates. But as far as I can tell, there is no mass migration into South Korea and Japan. So we have created conditions that made us, let's say, the prime destination for this mass migration. I think that is something that needs to be altered. And the last point, if I get this few seconds,
yep.
I'm an old-school imperialist, 150 years past my sell-by date. So I can say this, which is we probably have to consider, we would not call it neo-imperialism, we would call it, I don't know, a nation-building outreach programs, whatever you want to call it, that some countries, unfortunately, are not capable of governing themselves. So the choices are clear. Either you make a fortress Europe, or you so we go out of the fortress and try to, quote-unquote, I hope this is not recorded, and try to bring a form of civilized order to these places. There is, last point, I like the idea of human rights. I like the idea of universal human rights. But I think we must also accept that there are many different people in this world who look at the world very differently from us. If October 7th has not shown that, I think what else will? This is a very, I promise the last point, but it's such important. We are so socialized in, which is a good thing, but we are so socialized in a Christian worldview that we assume that our values are by nature universal, that they apply to everyone. But this is not how many others see the world. And I think there is a danger in sacrificing ourselves in a belief that many in the world are not sharing.
Well, please join me in giving a big round of applause. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating panel. We're going to have some coffee now, and then we have a very exciting final session. So please come back. Great.
All right.
That was great. Really, really great.